All right. Okay, let's see how much I can cover. Put the quiz behind you. You did your best. It's only 25 points, worth 1 lab report. So no big deal. Don't put a lot of focus on it. Okay, it's just for having you learn and study to prepare for the midterm. You have plenty of points. Don't worry about it too much. Okay, let's get back to this. I think this is what we talked about last on Friday. Okay. So we were talking about pumps, low pressure pumping or low pressure mixing and high pressure mixing. We talked about that. So I'm going to move on to the injector. So you've seen in the lab 2 types of injections. You have the auto injection where you had a tray, and then in there you put up to 50 samples. Some tray actually can hold 100 samples, depending on the type of equipment you have. And sometimes you have a cooling system that you can cool this whole compartment. What's the benefit of a cooling system for injection? Let's just bring you back to life a little bit. So, yes, Dan?
So some of the more volatile substance and get evaporated.
Volatile or potentially that substances that are less stable that can degrade over time at room temperature. So you might get some compounds, especially phenolics, they can oxidize over time at room temperature. So if we cool them, we prevent degradation. So you don't see kind of underestimation over time, especially if you have like 50 to 100 samples that you're running overnight. So a cooling system really is great. And then you all saw the automation of the needle coming in and penetrating this septa in the cap of those little vials, going in and taking out automatically 20 microliters. And we heard these sounds of opening valves and closing valves. So basically, when the sample is ejected, we hear valves opening, allowing the mobile phase to go through your sample loop to carry the sample. Otherwise, valves are closed and the mobile phase bypasses the sample loop. So it doesn't always pass through the sample loop. Only upon injection, for a few seconds, the valves open, allow the mobile phase to go into your sample loop and take the sample into the mobile phase onto the column. So we do have different sample loop sizes, so they can be as small as 20 microliters, and they can be as big as 200 microliters, allowing for variation of volumes to be injected on the column, depending on the capacity of your stationary phase. Okay, so remember capacity, we talked about it last time. All right, so depending on how big your column is, how much stationary phase you have, the capacity indicates how much volume or concentration of sample you can inject on your column. And then we saw the manual injection. We have 2 in the lab. You saw manual injection and you saw automated injection. Does anybody remember why in a lab, when you have a convenience of a manual injection, auto injection, why would you need a manual injection? All right, Ash?
If you have a sample that's really unstable, might need to get the machine quickly and wait around for it to be honest.
Actually, your auto sample is quick enough, is automated, it doesn't have as much error. You can, whatever you can do with the manual injection, let me make this easier, you can do with the auto injector, Kevin.
So usually has to do with your sample size. So like if you're just needed to test 1 sample a day, then you probably are just going to manually inject it.
Students are lazy.
Yeah. No.
Usually.
But if you just have
I'm lazy, so I would prefer auto injection over Manual injection. Money talks. All right, so manual injection is much cheaper than auto injection. So if you are setting up your lab and you have such funding, not a lot of funding, and you want 2 HPLCs, then you can make sure you have 1 auto and 1 manual. And those students that you don't like and they're lazy, what do you do with them? You give them the manual injection. No, you don't do that. I don't do that. It's basically we get priority on auto injection if you have a lot of samples, you want to run overnight. And the manual injection, if you have 2-3 samples, Kevin, you're right there. If you have only 2-3 samples and the other one is used, is busy, then you can do that. If you don't have money at all, you can just buy the manual inject and live with that. All right, columns. You've seen the HPLC column. They're very different than GC columns. They're stainless steel columns and they are pre-packed columns. Some are packed, some are, you can see capillary as well. You can have capillary columns in HPLC, but mostly is your packed stainless steel column, but they come in different dimensions. So they're different length and also different width, diameter, I would say. So they vary in dimensions, so it allows you to have flexibility in your capacity. So when capacity is important, you go for thick column, maybe not too long, too tall of a column. So it really gives you this flexibility in terms of, do you care for resolution, separation, perfect separation, sharp peaks, or do you really care for just a little bit of separation and a lot of capacity because you want to collect the fractions and use them for later testing? So you'll see we'll talk about UPLC later. When you have ultra performance liquid chromatography, use capillary columns. So here you really care for short analysis time, sharp peaks, and you don't really want to collect them after that. Or you have an MS detector attached to it, very sensitive. You don't need large quantity for sensitivity. So we talked about 3 columns, or we call them guard columns. You saw them in the lab as well. They're tiny little things that are attached to the column, so that your sample, the mobile phase, goes through the 3 columns before hitting the column. So do you remember what the function of the guard column is? Yes, Ingrid?
Was it to remove like
Absolutely. So you want to remove impurities. You want to remove compounds that might bind very strongly to your stationary phase in your column and reduce the capacity of your column. So basically bind and block your functional groups. So when your samples go in, they don't have enough functional groups to connect with the column or to interact with the stationary phase. So when you have these guard columns, they basically are filtering out any impurities. So, and the guard column, inside of it, you have the exact same material that is in your column. So if you're running a reverse phase with C18, you will have a C18 material in your guard column. That means silica attached to a chain of 18 carbons. So, but the guard columns, you need to change them often because they will get saturated. And if they get saturated, then impurities are going to go into the column, and also you'll see back pressure on your column. You see your pressure going up. The first thing you want to do when your pressure goes up, you want to check if your guard column is the cause of that back pressure. You remove it, you try it again, and if it is the cause, then you just change your guard column. Usually, rule of thumb, with every column, you buy 3 guard columns. So you change at least 3 times, and then maybe your column is about to retire after that. So that's the function of guard columns. I had another thought, but then it escaped me. Yeah, it might come back. We'll see. Any questions about guard columns? So the columns themselves, they can be microbore that with an internal diameter of 0.5 to 2.5 millimeters, or they can be micro columns, so much narrower in diameter and or capillary columns. If you remember, we talked about last time about the enhanced sensitivity and speed of the run, of the analytical run. So if you have a very narrow column, okay, excuse my drawing, and this is all packed versus a wider column, all packed, like microbore, and then capillary columns. These are even narrower, and not only narrow, they only have very thin stationary phase, very thin stationary phase on around the interior of the column. So it's not packed, it's not all full like that. So the benefit of having narrower columns or even capillary column, you have faster equilibration time. So you reach equilibrium faster, you have much less diffusion, longitudinal diffusion within your column, and then your peaks are nice, sharp, and long. Nice, sharp, long. Instead of maybe sharp, but not too long, and a little bit wider if you use the microbore. So the benefit of having really sharp, maybe I didn't draw it really, this supposedly sharper than this. I want to put it side by side. Shorter, a little wider. You might still get good separation here between two, that's fine, but sometimes you lose on sensitivity. So this height is absorption, let's say, or whatever it is, ion chromatogram, it would be ion abundance or refractive index, or whatever is your detector. Let's say it's absorption. Then here you have lower absorption. So at lower concentration, you will also have very small peak that might not be, there would be below your standard curve, let's say, below your linear standard curve range. So when you do that, then you really, when you use capillary column, you're enhancing the sensitivity. So you get higher height because your band is so narrow and it can be detected better than a shorter peak. So sometimes, depending on the concentration of your analyte, you want to go for narrow and high peaks. So you go for capillary and or microcolumns. So, and then, but if you care for capacity, this would not work for you. You want to go for microbore. So it really depends. And also if analysis time is an issue, capillary column is much faster. So enhanced sensitivity, and when you have low concentrations and you have powerful detector and you want quick analysis time, you go for UPLC, which is ultra performance liquid chromatography. Packed microbore and microcolumns contain, so HPLC columns in general have very small particle size, and you want to always have very small pores as well, the smallest possible depending on your compound, so you have very sharp bands going and you don't have those diffusion in the stationary phase rather than going in and out and equilibrating fast. All right, so let's see if you grasped what I was talking about or you were listening and not thinking about your quiz. Okay, Hal.
Is it all the above due that are
All of the above. Yes, you're right. You were listening. Thank you. Yes, so you have better separation. You have higher sensitivity because we're talking about higher heights. And then you have reduced equilibrium time because then you reach equilibrium fast because you have little bit of stationary phase material. There's not enough material for the compound to just go in and enjoy its interaction with the color. The mobile phase is going and reaching equilibrium really fast. So good. All right. So when we think about packing material, this is kind of like a known thing. HPLC columns usually have very sturdy support as a packing material. You have very well-defined particle size that have very close like standard deviation between them. So you don't have large and small and wide range of particle size. It's really narrow and tight and small particle size. You have enough mechanical strength so that you can run under high pressures. Good chemical stability in general. You do lose chemical stability with overuse of your column. You can deplete your functional groups or degrade them. Pore diameter, always the smallest pore size possible, unless you have large molecules that you are running through, like large carbohydrate, large protein, you go for a bigger pore size to allow these molecules to go through your stationary phase. So we work a lot with bonded phases like reverse phase C4, C18, C30. You have a wide range of that. We talked about bonded. So you have your silica that is not interacting with the column, and then you have chemically bonded phase here that is your main stationary phase. So this is one type. Another type is you have really an inert core, inorganic, doesn't necessarily have any functionality, except it's an absorbent to a thin coating. So it could be like cellulose, for example, made up of cellulose or alumina or whatever, and then you have your very thin coating around it as your stationary phase. Now the porous type, where the whole system is interacting with your analytes, you have micropore. We talked about polystyrene dibenzene last time, and then so these are porous, but usually small molecular or micropore, so small diameters. Okay, so for smaller molecules. The other kind, which is a polymeric that can be made of like polysaccharide type of resin, you can either have micropores, like very highly chained, very small pore size for small molecules, or it can be macropore, very loose polymer with large pore size for large molecules like large carbohydrates and large proteins. I have 5 minutes. Ovens. Okay. We also saw ovens in the HPLC lab, and we talked about the importance of regulating the temperature and having constant temperature. Why is that? I say here, reduce retention time, enhances resolution. What happens if we just run without an oven? Like we put the column in the environment and then we're running our samples. What could go wrong? Go ahead, Kevin.
There could be
In the room. So when you have temperature fluctuation in the room, what happens to your mobile phase? What physical property will change in your mobile phase, Stella? Yes, the viscosity. So when it's colder in the room, the viscosity increases. When it's warmer in the room, the viscosity decreases. So what happens when the viscosity increases to your retention time? When you have higher viscosity. Yes, so you have less mobility, slower mobility, then you have reduced, well, you reach equilibrium at longer time, then the compound takes longer time to leave the column. So let's say you're running your standards and the temperature in the room was 27. And then you ran your samples and then the temperature in the room is 20. It just got colder. What happens? Your retention time of the samples will be longer than the retention time of the standards, and that will mess you up. You won't be able to determine what is what. And then with higher temperatures, like for caffeine, we ran at 37 degrees, if you remember, or 38. So what happens then is it's higher than room temperature. So you are increasing the mobility, enhancing some kinetic energy there. So you have better separation because your compounds are moving faster and you have sharper peaks, equilibrating faster. So you get enhanced separation and you reduce your retention time. If we run it at 25, yes, in an oven, controlled temperature, it's just going to take slower time to equilibrate and longer run time. So you want to find the sweet spot where the temperature is not too high, they're not moving very fast, and then you lose resolution, and then it's not too low, and then your run is slow, and then you don't have nice resolution. So there's always this compromise. Okay, I have 3 minutes, so I'll go over the different detectors, but maybe I will just only have time for our UV vis detector. So UV vis is basically, you're measuring absorption, and you're measuring absorption either at UV wavelength, ultraviolet, or visible light, visible wavelength. So we'll talk about spectroscopy, if not next lecture, maybe the lecture after that. But basically, it's a chromophore. You're measuring the absorption of a chromophore. That means a substance that can absorb light in the range of UV or visible. So sometimes you have these compounds are naturally chromophores. So they can absorb light like proteins. They have those amino acid tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine that can absorb their phenolics amino acids, so they can absorb light. So they are present in all proteins, so all proteins absorb light. Polyphenols, phenols absorb light. Color compounds, pigments, they absorb light. But sometimes you have compounds that don't absorb light, and you want to measure them using UV, you make a chemical reaction that generates a compound from that chemical reaction that absorbs light. So you can use a UV detector. So you do some sort of a derivatization step that makes those compounds, all of them that you're interested in, absorb light. So we talked about in the lab about 2 sources of lamps that are commonly used in HPLC UV detector. Deuterium lamp gives you light mostly in the range of the UV, ultraviolet. Tungsten lamp gives you light in the range of visible. Okay, so the UV usually is between 200 to 400 nanometer, and your visible light is between 400 and 800 nanometer. We'll talk more about it during spectroscopy. So in variable wavelength detector, we also had it in the lab, and we showed you that we didn't run our samples on them because they're limited in terms of you can select 1 or 2 wavelengths. You don't give a fingerprint like with the PDA. But they offer sensitivity when you determine your lambda max. Do you remember what lambda max is? I'm going to finish in a minute. Do you remember what your lambda max is? What does lambda max stand for? Tam?
It's the wavelength at which it absorbs the
Max. Exactly. So that's where you can select your appropriate wavelength. You can sometimes select 2, or even at a certain time point in the line have the UV detect at a different wavelength. You have option of 2 wavelengths in these detectors. Okay, I will stop here and let you go. I'll see you on Wednesday.
So,